Hello guys, it's time to continue our monthly tradition on this channel, so roughly 10 or dozen of tips in roughly 10 minutes. The last one was November edition, and now let's see what I came up with, what I collected, what I curated over the December of 2024. And this is the tip number 1, comes from Sandro. And usually my tips come from Twitter, most of them, but for the first time on this channel in the series I mentioned Blue Sky. Quite a lot of people migrated from Twitter to Blue Sky or do both, post on both platforms, and I do occasionally read Blue Sky. I'm not on there yet, I haven't registered, but if I see some important Laravel tip or news, I will totally retweet it and add to these videos. So what Sandra is suggesting is if you have any missing translations in your Laravel, you can get notified about that. So here's the image, zoomed in. Did you know that in the app service provider you may add lang handle missing keys using? This is the method with 4 parameters, and then, for example, you may log that as an error or send notification to someone or perform any other operation you want. So this is the fallback if there's no translation for a specific key. The next tip comes from myself, which is 2-in-1 tip, how I usually create selects dropdowns in Blade. I didn't expect that tweet to be so popular, but with almost 200 likes, I guess it's important. So what I do in the controller, I do pluck with name field and ID as a key, then it becomes a key, and then as a result you don't need to do in Blade for each users as user and then work with user object. You immediately work with key value pair of ID and name, and this makes the code a bit shorter, and also you may use selected without user ID using just ID variable. The next tip comes from Newton Job. Did you know that there's validation rule called exclude? So for example, you need to validate something, and this is a great example of terms and conditions. So for example, you need to validate that the checkbox is checked, but then later you don't need the value of that field later when you create the object or later in the life cycle of that page. So if you do exclude, then user create validated will not contain that terms as a key. In most cases, even if it does contain the terms, if you don't have that field in the database, that is fine, but this is actually kind of a cleanup, I would say, just in case, but still sometimes useful. The next tip comes from Mohammad, who is kind of on and off on Twitter. I see him kind of silent for a few months and then getting back full speed with a lot of tips almost every day. So good to see him back again with active Twitter tips. And here's the tip. If you have complex queries, database queries, you may create classes, separate classes, PHP classes with method execute, for example, and then call that class from your controller instead of putting all that long query inside of the controller itself. It's kind of a way of refactoring that controller method would not be too long with too much logic, offload that logic if it's a bigger query to a specific class. And one of the benefits, it's easier to test queries separately. Maybe the same query could be reused in other controller or other class, or you could write even a unit test for that as well. The next tip comes from myself, and it's about API and relationship. There is a method called whenLoaded, and see how it works. For example, you need to load the task with user, but only in some endpoints. You use the same resource in a few endpoints in a few controllers, but sometimes you need task with user and sometimes you don't. So then depending on whether controller loads, eager loads task with user or not, then the result will or won't contain that user resource. Then it helps to avoid n+1 query to load the relationship, although it's not even needed. The result is something like this: task list with user resource inside of each task. The next tip comes from Osama, and this is about eloquent method with where has. Quite often we need to load some record with relationship and also check whether there is at least one record in that relationship. And before Laravel 8, from what I remember, we did that separately with condition, where has condition. And I think from what I remember in some minor Laravel 8 version, they released this method. Here's the zoomed in image with where has in 1. So before we had this, so some condition, which becomes a condition inside of a callback function, making the query a bit shorter. The next quick tip comes from Punyapal, and this is about Livewire. I don't even know where I would use it, but I didn't know that it is possible to check if the request comes from Livewire. I haven't tried it myself, to be honest, so I'm not sure which conditions are met to be from Livewire. Is it just that /update URL endpoint used by Livewire, or is it for any request? I'm not sure. But if you do need to check whether it's from Livewire, there is apparently a method to do that. The next tip comes from Newton Job again, second time in this video, but a very cool tip with code created by himself, by Newton, so I decided to share it as well. Config share inside of handle inertia request like this. Then there's macro for config, which you can use, for example, like this in the controller. The next tip comes from myself, and this is about JSON fields and about using them in factories, how to seed fake data. So here's an example. In the database, we have JSON amenities cast to array in the model, and then in the factory, did you know you can do something like this? Random elements, provide the array hard-coded or from somewhere else, from config or whatever, and then specify the random number, fake number from 3 to 8 from those random elements. So on top here you see example of one random element, just a simple thing, but this is more complicated. If you want the randomized number of elements, and that number would be within the range you specify. The next tip comes from Aniket, and this is more like a recommendation of a package than a tip. If you need to have webhooks in your web application, for example, working with payment providers, you need to have URL for webhook. When, for example, Stripe informs you that the payment is successful or failed or something like that, you need to catch that in your webhook URL. And then there's a lot of validation happening between those two parties, and that's why the package of Spotty Laravel webhook is very useful. And here's an example. You can use the URLs, the payloads, some secret timeouts, attempts, and other syntax options. Just find it on GitHub, Spotty Laravel webhook. And lastly, I want to finish with Blade tip by Anand here, which was improved in the reply to this tweet. So let's take a look. If you want to have a dynamic view file, so you don't know which template it is, here's the zoomed in image, and you return the view with variable template, and you find that template by request query, otherwise falling back to default, and before that you scan the file system whether that file actually exists. If it doesn't, it still goes back to default. So this is kind of cool, but then later in this tweet, Ollie suggested a much shorter solution to all of that. So instead of checking all that file system and validating all of that, there's a method called view first. Again, a zoomed in image, view first, it would take templates with request template, and if that file doesn't exist, you provide the fallback. That's it. So this is one of those cases where there is a certain method that allows you to not create specific longer code unless that longer code contains some custom logic which doesn't work with that view first, for example. So yeah, these are the tips from December 2024, and we will continue the monthly tradition in February with the tips from January. Which one is your favorite from this video? Let's discuss in the comments below. What did you learn? That's it for this time, and see you guys in other videos.